So I wanted to share with you a conversation that I had recently with Erica Brooke. Erica has spent over 20 years in the medical diagnostic industry and has also worked as a death doula. And one of the things that she does now is combine those two experiences to create thought-provoking conversations about transformation, specifically on death and what it means to be your own death doula, how we allow ourselves, an ego death doula, how we allow ourselves to let our ego continuously die so that we can transform and expand and grow. So I really was excited to have this conversation with Erica because, as many of you know, death is a subject that I have had a lot of personal experience with, and also have been really diving into the concept of what does it mean to let your ego die. So I loved this idea of being your own death doula, what a death doula even is, and how we can apply that concept every day, especially in such a game-changing time in the world where, whether we like it or not, old systems are dying, new systems are coming to be, and our old way of being is having to die. So we're all going through a death, and specifically an ego death. And so I think Erica's wisdom and just her ideas and thoughts in this area are really thought-provoking and interesting. And I would love to hear your comments and your ideas and experiences with this conversation in the comment section below. I've also included information about Erica and all of her social media links in the description box below as well. So I hope you enjoy.
All right. So you and I, of course, have been talking about the idea of ego deaths and how relevant ego deaths are in this current shift. And there's something, a phrase that you brought up that really activated something within me, and that is the ego death doula. And that's what we kind of were like, let's have a conversation about this. Let's dive deep, because I think it's multi-layered, and I think it's probably more relevant than even I realize, because I know that death has been such a significant thing in my life, actual death. But what I've realized in healing from the death of my mom and the death of my nephew and the death of people I love, I have had to go through about 500,000 other deaths that had to do with holding on, had to do with fear, had to do with seeing myself in a different way than I previously could see myself, so I couldn't evolve. And I've just been really, and even as a Scorpio, you brought up earlier, like, what sign are you? Scorpio rules death and sex. And I've always thought those two things are interrelated. And anyway, the concept of death and the topic of death, I think, as morbid or as like people kind of back away from it, I wanted to dive into this conversation with you. And I'm so curious about how the phrase ego death doula came up for you, and kind of what sparks for you in that whole realm.
Right. Yeah. So the ego death doula phrase itself is something that came up, but I didn't even really like it because it sounded, I don't know, it just wasn't the sound that I wanted. But the concept behind it was, so maybe start by saying what a doula is, or a death doula. It's similar to like a birth doula. So that's someone who helps a woman have a baby. A death doula is somebody who helps somebody transition from this life into another. So you're really with them through the dying process. And the reason I got into it was, like you, having a lot of personal experience with people dying, and then what that does to us and how many deaths we have to die because of it. But ultimately, I wanted to take the wisdom and the lessons and the awakening that I see in people as they go through their dying process and apply that to people who are full of life force. So we don't have to wait until we've been given a terminal diagnosis or a death sentence to go through this process. And that was always kind of my goal of becoming a death doula, was, yes, to be with patients who are dying, but also to have, speaking engagements or writing, or even just casual conversations with people, how you can really transform yourself, your life, take things to another level, and live fully now. And then ego death doula came up because of everything going on today. As you said, it's kind of relevant with everything that's going on in the world between COVID and all the politics, and just trying to create heaven on earth, or tapping into a new normal, or creating a new normal. So I thought, why not call it ego death doula, where we could really just do it, just have conversations about what does that look like, what does it mean, and maybe even bring some clarity around what is ego and why do we want to kill it? Why are we saying we got to kill the ego, and the ego's kind of gotten a bad rap?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the beginning of it, I guess, where it started.
In relation to politics and everything that's going on right now, one thing that I have felt so strongly is that where we get in these massive kind of ego struggles with each other are in areas where it seems we refuse, or we cannot see something different than what we've known, because that does require a death. It requires a death of the idea that how we see it and how we know it is the only way, and that familiarity to it. And I've wondered if when, as I've kind of been watching everything and feeling everything that's been going on, and I think collectively we would agree that it seems like our emotional maturity level as a whole is we're quite young. We're quite young when it comes to our collective humanity and how we deal with emotions. And I wonder, like, and just in terms of how you walked someone through the death process and then relating it to the ego death, how do you feel like emotions play into that, and the way that we are, the role fear has in holding on to what we know and being afraid to let go?
Mm-hmm. Right. So being afraid to let go is a key phrase that is a big part of truly the death process. But they don't have a choice, right? They know they're dying. So it sort of happens. I really see a lot of spiritual elements that just come in because you don't have the same life force to need to be right.
Yeah.
Or to need to convince people that your way is this way, or to even have an image that you thought you had of yourself. Because you have to slowly let that go to transition to the other side, or if there's even a side, to this other realm. But then tying that in with like you were saying with some of the stuff now, it's like so much of what I see, and I guess you are as well, with the politics, with even COVID and the fear of death, it is that fear. It's the fear that if this person gets elected, oh my God, this is going to be a terrible outcome. And there's a lot of hate, and there's a lot of needing to be right. I mean, that's the narrative I'm seeing on social media. It's almost mean. Like you said, it's almost immature. Like, I know you are, but what am I?
Yep.
And well, I've got a better burn than you. And what is it accomplishing? What is it really doing for humanity? What is it doing for individuals, other than putting a lot of sort of negative emotions or lower vibrational frustrations and fears into the forefront? So I guess kind of what happens with it is, can people, or are we willing to start having conversations that say, regardless of what I think today, either out there, or what I think of myself in here, what if I had to change it? What if I just got a terminal diagnosis that what I think right now no longer exists, or won't exist soon? How can I let go, and how can I sort of reach that almost I don't know, what would you call it, like a state of meditation, or a state of where you're just like, okay, what if I am wrong? You almost have to, because it's so polarized. Part of what happens in an ego death is, I thought this was this and this was right. What if this is right? And you have to be willing to just, it doesn't mean it is, but you have to be willing to let your energy, or the emotion of it, what if it is? And then in that place, okay, what if it is? What are you so afraid of? Let's talk about that. And what if it's a worst case scenario, and this and that? And where it ties into actual death is, none of it matters when you die. It does not matter to you if you die tomorrow who gets elected today. And the need to be right's not there. It's just, there's got to be a way we can walk through this and from that place where you've let it go, the need to be right, it's like almost your higher self, if you will, or that part of you that's eternal anyway, that can almost look down at earth and say, well, that's interesting. I don't know why I was so caught up in the emotion of that, and the present moment of it being so so much anxiety, so much fear.
Exactly. Well, when you were saying that, I thought a lot about how, when the information I've been getting about lack and abundance and how the lack matrix really works, which is about having to win or having to be right. And so we are in survival mode, and it's all we know, and we believe there's not enough, or there's not an afterlife, or there's not love, or there's not anything for us, and all we have is that I have to survive. But even that, it being in that state, you're still losing, because you're not, because the impetus for everything we do comes from needing something that we don't already have. And so it's that endless space of it. I keep saying it's like our creative energy, our creative life force being siphoned off to continue to fuel this reality of lack. And what you're saying, which is really profound, is that at the moment of death, or at any real crossroad where we have to come to terms with the fact that how we've seen the world may not be the way it is, that it doesn't matter anymore, because the criteria for winning is non-relevant. It's not even relevant in the space where you have to just surrender and trust. And the other part of it, and I wonder how relevant this is to what you're saying, is that with all the fighting going on, to me, it's like everyone's righteously fueled. This idea of like, almost everyone, no matter what they're defending or needing to prove or whatever, they feel this sense of, if I don't do it, it won't be done. If I don't protect this, it won't be protected. If I don't say something, it won't be said. And everyone's seemingly has a cause, a righteous cause, or a vulnerable demographic that they're fighting for. But I remember when I was younger and my mom was dying, and her siblings and her mom and my grandpa, and it was this massive, huge fight, because they blamed my dad that she got cancer because he dragged her into polygamy. And they had this whole narrative of like, if she would have stayed Christian, if she would have done that, even though she became a Christian at the end. But they essentially blamed my dad, and everyone fought around us for us kids. The fighting all happened in our name. Like, everyone was trying to protect us, defend us. They were fighting over who I would live with, where we would go. And I remember as a kid feeling like what hurts more than the fact that my mom's dying is this war that's going on, that's all being had in my name, but it's not actually for me, and it's not for my siblings at all. It is an ego war. I remember thinking that even as a kid, this has nothing to do with me. And for some reason, that has come back a lot with what's going on right now, is that something about death or things shifting, it brings up everyone's deepest fears, their deepest insecurities, where they've been wounded, where they feel afraid, what they feel like they're protecting. And I've just been thinking of how, if we really looked at ourselves and asked the question that you just said, like, who is this actually helping? And is it really helping? Like, if my objective is, I want these people to feel safe, or I want people who have immune deficiencies to be safe in COVID, or whatever I feel like I'm trying to protect, knowing what we know, even scientifically, about negative energy and how it affects our immune system, you'd think if we were really, really in alignment with what we say we wanted, we would know that fighting or resisting, which is often what we do in death, actually is counterproductive to what we want, to the transformation that we all are saying across the board. People are saying, this is messed up and it's broken and it needs to be fixed. We're in agreement about that. It's just the way it is, or who's in charge, or who gets to make the rules, or who gets to dictate to who what to do. It seems like that's where the ego's coming in and like creating this massive resistance. So if you were to think of that as a person that you were walking through a death process, like, how do we frame that part, or how would you help someone psychologically deal with that type of fear?
Right. Well, I think that the biggest thing that we start with, and this was an interesting thing when my best friend was really sick and we started talking, and I made the words, well, since you're terminal, and her aunt said, we're all terminal.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always stuck with me. I mean, the reality is we can fight death and be afraid of it and wear masks or not wear masks or social distance or need this person to be elected or this one, but we will all die,
Mm-hmm.
either physically or maybe not, but still, it's a new body, it's a new way. And so this way of existing is not going to last forever.
Mm-hmm.
It just isn't for any of us. So I think that's a commonality to humanity. And another thing that's common to humanity is dying.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what your color is or what your sexual orientation is or what political party you're a part of. We're all going to experience death of some sort when you look at death as just a lack of existence.
Yep.
Of the way things are. And so I try to start with just that as a broad thought and then go from there with a person. You know, some people aren't open to it. I mean, there is such a hold on, nope, I'm just not ready for that. I want the way things are, and they will fight and fight and fight. I mean, I think it's human nature to avoid change. People don't want to change what they eat for breakfast sometimes, you know, it's like this is just what I do. So when you talk about changing your life, changing your beliefs, it immediately triggers the ego. So you almost have to go backwards into it. Just like, okay, can we agree that some point in time you will die? And if they're going to argue with that, then that's sort of maybe not your audience.
Right. Exactly.
But when you think, okay, you are going to die at some point, the thing about a terminal diagnosis, and even where a death doula steps in, is they have the luxury of processing their life, going through regrets, unfinished business, anything they still feel guilt about or shame about, because they're getting ready to die. And so it brings all of that emotion to the surface and into a place of, I'm running out of time. I don't have time to argue over the petty stuff anymore. I don't have time to be self-critical or worry about my makeup even. I mean, just the everyday things. It's like so many things get distilled down to this core existence where the ego is, you know, like I guess ego is kind of defined as the sense of self-esteem, or, you know, self-importance. It's also defined in like psychoanalytic theory as like the part of you that mediates between conscious and unconscious.
Yeah.
So when you die, all of it's gone.
Yep.
So it's not that ego doesn't have a role. I mean, ego is an important part of being human, but when it's out of control, to your point, with this emotion of needing to be right, needing to fight for something, be at war with it, that's where it can cause problems, and that's where the idea of letting it die. So it doesn't mean kill it, murder it, go to war with your ego even. It almost means, okay, me and the 7 billion other people on the planet have this opportunity to only connect with ourselves. And if I were to die today, what would I do differently? What would I need to say to somebody? What would I want? And if you can go through that process, and it doesn't happen in an instant necessarily, it can be, you know, a daily practice, some of those layers go away where you find yourself releasing some of that tension of, let me get on Facebook and argue politics.
Yeah.
Let me make a comment about, oh, you're not wearing a mask, you must not care about anybody's life. It's like, listen, we're all gonna die.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's from COVID or it's from a car wreck or something else, I think we could approach it from a heart space.
Yeah.
From a common ground of, this is gonna happen to you too, Amanda. It's gonna happen to anybody who might be listening. So I don't know if I actually answered your question. I think we both have a tendency to kind of get rolling, and then it's like,
Yeah.
wait,
No,
what did you ask me?
I like it because as you were rolling, I was feeling so many different emotions, and I almost started crying because I was thinking about when you said, when you're in that space, you no longer care if you like about how your makeup looks, or like there's something about the surrender part of that space that is, anyone who has loved someone that has died knows how sacred that space is, like that just incredible sacredness of that space. And how I've been feeling that a lot lately with collectively people who are realizing what you're saying, like that. I think a lot of us intuitively feel that everything we've known is going away. It's everything's shifting. And even though there's these systems that are falling and dissolving, need to, because they are directly connected to lack. Not everything about them needs to, but the fundamental way in which energy has been circulating on this planet has been
Right.
through this inverted lack matrix. And
Right.
that delusion is falling. But we
Mhm.
have, our egos have been plugged in to that game, deeply plugged in. And so there
Mhm.
is a death happening. And even for me, I've been so nostalgic lately about everything. I keep feeling just nostalgic about my life, about things I've done, about even things I used to hate or resist. I just feel this like this amazing gratitude for every single aspect of my life and everything that has happened and led up to this moment. But I've been having conversations like this where people are feeling like something's ending, and it feels so palpable. And then you have the people holding on for dear life that don't
Mhm.
want to admit that anything's changed,
Fighting for it to be the same. Yeah.
fighting for it to be the same, or fighting for it to be their way, or and I don't know. You did answer my question, and I think that there's just that. When I tap into that space, all of a sudden, even the war that's happening, I can look at with gratitude, like
Mhm.
in a weird
Right.
way. I can just feel like, wow. And also that space of like, it doesn't matter, and yet it matters
Mhm.
so much,
Right.
and yet it doesn't matter.
And the thing is that I kind of heard from what you were saying too, is part of what's scary about death, an actual death, is they don't know what's next.
Yep.
So there's this whole process that I see people go through where they're processing what is and what was, because they know it won't any longer be. But then there's this sort of fear wall that's like, but what is next? What
Yep.
will happen to me after death? And well, that's a different answer for a lot of people. When we take that question to the normal before, or the things that are crumbling, these constructs that are crumbling before, and the fear of what's next, and that's where I think we can really tap into. If we let that fear go and trust that all things change, and we let go of the need to fight, the need to be at war with it, like you said, the feeling that I'm missing something, that I'm lacking something, then we have that energetic space to start thinking about, well, what do we want next? What do we want it to look like after the death of these current constructs?
Exactly.
I mean, even if you take it to like a political discussion, it's like, what do we all really want, regardless of who we would want to vote for? Why do we want to vote for them? And if you don't look at and these icons of, if you think of this candidate or this candidate and all the hate or the fear you bring to whoever wins, but we stop and say, as humanity, if I didn't know anything about your political affiliation, we probably both want safety, abundance, equality. I mean, we sort of want the same things. So could we tap into our hearts and the not need to be right, and just a creative space of what could that look like, regardless of who wins the election?
Exactly.
What could we do? I mean, there's like billions of us, and hundreds of them, if there's even an us and them. I mean, we are the they, but that's
Yeah.
so it's like letting all of that stuff go. Oh, just and then we can kind of focus on, well, what could be next, instead of recreating what was.
Well, and that seems to me a part of that space that a lot of people who get a terminal diagnosis will then, like, a lot of people will be like, hey, what's my bucket list? I'm going to live. Then I'm going to live. I'm going to live, and I want to do all the things I didn't do. I want to be more present in the moment. And people who can, a lot of times people end up reversing their illness just simply because
Right?
they get into that
They
now.
reverse their energy.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I wonder if that's part of the transformation that happens in death. And when you talk about a ego death doula, like, we don't necessarily have to physically die to change or to experience the transformation. And there's something about, I keep saying this, but if we don't know where we're going, if we don't have any sort of idea of what we're stepping into, then this would be the scariest time to be alive. And looking at, if it's only this or that, and or nothing, well, that's a terrifying scenario. But I've been really inspired by people who are inspired with a vision for the future, and people who are just resonate. For me, as I've started tapping into visionaries and people who literally are engineering a sustainable future for us, and I realize there's so many thought leaders, and there is an incredible amount of space where creativity is happening, and it's happening in the private sector. It's happening with individuals, and it's being creative, because when you don't wait for someone to give you permission or for a law to be passed to have permission, and you just do it. you just create what
or
you
a certain candidate, right?
exactly. Like, I can't live the life I want unless this candidate wins. Like, to me, that's not, it's giving so much power to the system that we're all saying is the problem.
We don't want anymore. Right.
Exactly. It makes no sense to me. And I just feel excited about the concept of what we're stepping into. And I wonder, even in the process of letting your ego die, if finding something that you're urging towards or excited about, or like being you use the word creativity. Like, how can we think creatively? Like, just because this is ending, what are the possibilities of what's beginning? And if I can
Right.
start getting excited about it, then maybe I could reverse my life force energy. Instead of just spiraling into that tech of death, literally death of a system, death of a way, all of it, instead, like, reversing it into the spiral of life and what's being
right.
built.
Well, and it's also, even, what do we think about death itself? When we think about death from, you've lost your mother, I've lost my father and my brother, anyways, a lot of people.
Yeah.
It feels, I mean, even Halloween, you think of death, you think of skeletons and evil and scary and darkness. But what doesn't make sense about that to me is when somebody's actually dying, we don't think that's where they're going. We think they're going to heaven or fly high, you're pain free, you're in paradise. So why are we so afraid of it?
Yeah. Yep.
And what if that's the same, that reality of true death? What happens and where do you go? Typically, when like I said, we think of it here as this dark, scary, grave, decay, because that does happen to the physical body, but we believe the spirit, many of us, goes on to something expansive and love and light and pure. What if that's what's happening in the physical 3D reality now? Something is dying, but that doesn't, it's going in peace. It's going into something, like, it's, instead of it's going backwards into the grave and we're going to be in lack and cold and darkness, what if it's dying so that we can expand into heaven on earth?
Yes. That's where I feel my urge just like on fire when I think of what is coming from the ashes of what's being burned. And
right.
I've brought this up before, and you probably know this because you grew up in a Christian background, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Sort of. I had a half and half. Half of my family did. How their half was like, that's stupid. So I was always conflicted.
Yeah. See, and I was between the Mormon and the like evangelical Christian, half and half. Yeah. It was a weird hybrid, but I remember there's a verse in the Old Testament that says, without a vision, the people will perish. And that always stuck out to me. And I remember the first time I read it, I was very Christian at the time, but I remember crying and praying and saying, I don't have a vision. I don't see any future for myself. I literally could not see a future because nothing about what I knew had any sort of appeal to me. And that's before I knew any of this existed, like who I am now and what I'm doing. And even that's transitioning, but I didn't know there was a future. And I am amazed at what happens when we can tap into a vision.
Right.
And how it can just, and we know we're creators. We know what we think we fuel. So it's like just shifting our perspective slightly into, instead of focusing on the problem, focusing on solutions. Instead of focusing on what you're losing, focusing on what you're gaining, or who you might be becoming. And I think that we tend to get afraid to do that, or people think it's bypassing. And I don't know, what do you think about that? Because I know there's an acceptance and a surrender in death that is important. But I think that other side is important too.
Well, one of the things I see as people are dying is that, there's, even if you think, okay, what do you think happens after death? Some people say nothing. Some people say, it depends on your religion, really, often, or your lack thereof. But what we sit with people who are dying is, what do you want to have happen when you leave here?
Yeah.
And so I think that's and imagine excruciating pain, laying on your deathbed, trying to get your head around, what do I want? And meditating into that. How much easier, I don't know if that's the right word, that is if you're not in pain and you're not dying and you do have all of you actually have an opportunity to create what you want it to look like in the future. So I think that's, an aspect of it. And I guess I don't really remember the exact question because for some reason it went away when I answered that part.
No, and I think it was. I was just basically saying it feels like a process of dying is having to accept it and having to surrender to it. But it also seems like having a vision of what you're going into helps people.
Yeah, that helped me remember. So that's the thing. I mean, that's part of death meditation when somebody is transitioning, and that can be, you know, hours to days where they're just like in a labor. You know, sometimes a woman's in labor for a lot of hours, and sometimes she just has the baby. It's the same thing with death. But part of what we do during that transition is called it's visioning. It's them. You're sitting with them, talking softly. Do they and it's individual. Some people want to be in a forest all alone. Other people want to be staring at the ocean and they just float into it and that's it. Other people want all their family around. So you actually engage them in creating that vision in real time. So it's something we can do, to your point, or to that point. I mean, you and I could do it, right? When we close our eyes and think, okay, COVID happened and the world turned upside down and we've got things on fire and rioting and the world's just kind of in a crazy place right now. It doesn't mean I might not be able to change the world, but if I could, what would that look like inside? So it's a way of being, not necessarily a way of doing.
Yes. I think that's something I've been talking about a lot, is how our most potent and powerful vote is in our resonance, in how we are being. That speaks so much louder. That can affect someone and change someone, or give someone a different perspective, or give someone hope, literally prevent a suicide, even the way we are being. Versus if we show up in our essence, in this resonance of what we want, rather than in fighting what we don't want, it's a completely different energy, and it's felt and accepted and experienced differently. And I don't think we get, and that's what just going back to the point I made about being a kid and seeing my mom's family all fighting over why she was dying and who got to do what, and thinking that they were doing it all for us. But the resonance and the space they held was way more detrimental and painful than had they been able to come together in peace. And
or just be present. Even.
Just be present.
Sometimes it's present. Sometimes all you can do is like, I can't think about the past or the future. I'm just love in the present. If you're in pain right now, let's be here right now. You know,
exactly.
It really is. And I think that's where what you describe about how your family was being kind of reminds me of how we're being as a collective, or some of us are being as a collective. It's like, let's continue to fight about how did we get here? Whose fault is it? Which candidate is it? And it's all external. Are we going, well, hold on a second. How did I get so much hate in my heart? How am I so frustrated? How did I end up in a world where it's like this? And it's not that you're blaming yourself. It's just, to me, I'd love to tie in a lot of the teachings where it says, as without, so within, or we create our own reality. So how did we get here then? How are we living in a world? And sometimes the answer is, I have no fucking idea. And that's okay. But then to your point, you can kind of shed that. It's just like people on their deathbed. How did I end up with cancer at 35, or however old my best friend was, 37? You know, how does that even happen? Well, I don't know. But here we are. And so I think it's the same kind of process. I mean, that's the idea of ego death doula. It's, can we just tie all those pieces together and move forward? And another piece to that is, at least where I believe, or what I've seen with a lot of people, is when they die, I think they view themselves as limitless. So I had a friend who was in a wheelchair. Of course, I don't think she thinks that when she dies and is in her eternal whatever, that she still can't walk. And so part of ego death is, okay, here's the story I've told myself about who I am today, my self-identity, my self-importance, or my lack thereof even. Something we can start thinking about is, we don't have to die to be eternal. You know, we're eternal right now. And not only are we eternal right now, we're divinely empowered right now. Like, that veil is so thin. And I'm not one who can see it. I can't say that I can see across it or feel things, you know, I don't. But it doesn't mean I can't believe it. It doesn't mean I can't say, okay, well, empower me. What do I have to lose? And when my friend was really sick, we would did all kinds of stupid stuff. And if we got caught, and it wasn't bad things, just cutting a line or, you know, whatever, just a little crazier, we just played the cancer card. And it was like, nobody cared because she was dying. You could tell she was dying. She looked terrible. But what if we were like that in general? What if we just let people live and be and come alive without all of these rules and stereotypes? And I guess I just see it so loudly with the masks or the lack thereof. I mean, sometimes if you aren't wearing a mask, you can get a lot of hate for that. I mean, there's just these strains, like, just let it go, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think that when I feel into the fear, even around that, it and this is probably true for any fear, but it comes deep into like, if this doesn't change, if this external thing outside of me isn't how I need it to be or how it should be or whatever, I'm in danger. And if I'm in danger, then I can't just let go. I can't just let and be, because if I'm in danger, it means I might die. And then it goes right back to what you were saying. Like, that's where the stronghold is, this fear of death. Hence why I loved when we were talking before and you brought up the concept of an ego death doula, like taking it that one step further. Like, we're collectively going through a death, an ego death. And it just really resonated in my whole being, that idea that, and I've said this before, I truly believe that if we allowed ourselves to die over and over, if we truly had no resistance to death, and we could just let perspectives die, let ideas die, and let new ones be reborn. That's the other part of it, is the birth. I wonder if we would even have to physically die, because I think that death is the body in such resistance that it finally is just like, hey, I'm letting go, because I can't, life force can no longer expand in it, because the perspective, the ego, has such control on what can be and what can't be, what is and what isn't, what's allowed and what's not allowed. That rigidness, to me, is what causes death in the first place, or blockages of energy signals in the body, you know? So I feel like it's so insanely relevant on every level. And I kind of can't wait to see what happens. Even just this conversation circulating, just even within my small little community, I think that it's so relevant, and people are craving it. And people, I think, instinctively, especially people who are kind of tapped in, instinctively are feeling like, oh, I have to die. Like, I don't really have a choice. And like you said, that's actually objectively true as well.
Right.
You know, which is really an interesting concept to wrap your head around.
Yeah. Well, and two, I think that the one difference, because of the state we're in right now, where we are alive with life force in a physical body, it's gonna, like, it's not death as in you're killing that and it never comes back. It's almost like resurrection. It's more finding those parts of you that are more true, instead of looking for the things that aren't true to kill.
Yes. It's such a subtle shift in perception. But to me, that's where the surrender is. And it's like, every time I get there, I can feel when I feel myself holding on tightly to something, or feeling like I need to be right, or the energy of that, it doesn't actually ever feel good. But I'll find myself perpetuating it. And then when I finally am like, wait, what am I doing? Like, why am I so obsessed with having to be right about this, or having to win about this, or whatever? And if I just do exactly what you just said, just slightly shift my perception into, well, what is it that I actually want?
Or why do I want to be right?
Why do I want to be
right? Get me.
Yeah, exactly. And how can I focus on whatever that state of being is that I'm trying to get out of my resistance? Like, skip the step of resisting it and just tune into what it is. And then do that. It sounds so simple. It's harder than it sounds. It's harder than it sounds. But at the same time, I think that that's exactly what we're all being asked to do right now, on a collective level, an individual.
Well, and sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, that's it. I just said an individual and collective level, I think.
Right. And I think that in some ways it has happened, like you said, collectively. I mean, literally, because of the lockdowns, because of things, something happened on a global scale that said, we all need to focus on ourselves more. We all need to kind of go within, type that, network with smaller groups if you're of that mindset. But do you know what I mean? So it's like forced a lot of us to stop going and doing and entertaining. Or these are all things that are not bad, but a lot of it is ego driven. It's, okay, my sense of who I am socially, my sense of who I am professionally, and all of it's changed. We're working from home now. We're like less socially active. And so it's kind of, where I think the ego can easily get triggered in all of this is boredom.
Yeah.
We're so used to entertaining ourselves with something, concerts, sports, whatever. Not that these are bad. I'm not saying that. It's part of the human experience, but it's such a distraction from none of that is going with us in the next life.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, if you're dying, like physical death.
Yeah.
And so there's, even if you just spend a day or a few hours going into this space of what would an ego death look like, it doesn't mean that you won't still go to the concert tomorrow. It's not. And that's the difference. An ego death, like you said, it's a sort of a perpetual rebirth. And I kind of liken it unto nature. I mean, every year we see the seasons change and it looks like the tree died, and it goes into itself and it nurtures, and then spring comes and it gets warmer and it's even bigger this time, and maybe the blooms are bigger, and it just keeps getting better, but it dies over and over to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's what ego death doula is, just remembering that that's the same with our humanity. We're not just here, we're born, and now we live, or are we dying the whole time?
Yeah.
It's an important difference.
Yeah. And then the idea that it's both, and it's happening simultaneously, and it can happen simultaneously. And I think that I would love to like continue this conversation, because I feel like there's so many different like branches of how this applies in all different ways in our personal life and our relationships. I've been thinking about it in relation to relationships, and often what we block when we're so invested in the game and in the distraction and in winning and in all of that, we often miss completely what is really for us, what would really bring to our soul, what would really make us come alive, because we don't even consider it an option, because we're so used to believing that sacrifice is just necessary, lack is just permanently part of it, and so we just have to live in this half alive, half dead state and try to avoid really fully transforming or transmuting all that lack. And so I wonder if that's like part 2 of this conversation. We'll see if we get inspired to do it, but like, what does the other side look like, you know?
Yeah, I think it's an overwhelming experience to have an ego death the first few times. And sometimes it's frustrating because you feel like you can almost feel yourself, your heart will race like, nope, this is what I do for a living. This is who I am, or this is what I want. And so it's just, I think even when you first start to open yourself to the idea of it and really thinking about, well, I am going to die, whether that's physically or like you said, I mean, maybe there's an opportunity to get our resonance and our energy in such a way. I mean, even certain spiritual and religious teachings say that some of us won't die physically.
Yeah.
And it seems like we could be in that time now where maybe we're there. And so, it's interesting that it took this supposed plague or pandemic where people are dying to really kind of catalyze this thinking of maybe not, maybe that's just part of it. And it's interesting that a lot of people think it's fake and it's a plan, or, you know, so it's like, who knows? I mean, that's not the point of our topic, but I think it's also relevant that something that was supposed to kill a lot of people is at the forefront of where we are right now. Totally.
And death, the fear of death, and is really actually, if you look at it, kind of the core of what we're fighting about, you know, like who's most vulnerable to die and why, you know, like, and what can we all do to prevent it? Like, that's kind of the big conversation.
I just wrote a small piece about that. I mean, it's really short, that what we're doing is masking fear. Like the masks themselves, and you know, there's on both sides, fear that you're going to get COVID, fear that you're going to give somebody else COVID, fear that they don't work, fear there's too much pollution, and there's fighting, and there's all over masks. And underneath all of that, are we masking the fear of death?
Yeah. Yes.
And if we could get to that fear of death, we would let go. I mean, so many other things would dissipate. We could really come more powerfully into creating what we do want. Because now I'm not afraid if I'm made fun of. I'm not afraid if my hair looks stupid. I mean, that's a stupid example, but you know what I mean? Because I've died. Like, I've been dead before, you know, metaphorically. So who cares? And if I get embarrassed or if I fail, well, I'll just I'll just be reborn again
Yeah,
and start over, even in the same life force, the same lifetime. And it really is possible.
it is. And I think it's the most freeing place to be when you get to that point where you don't care anymore, where you realize like the things that I prioritized and that mattered so much to me, that I put so much energy in, now don't really matter. And there's an immense amount of like freedom that comes from that, from letting go of the game, of having to be right, of having to win, of having to have enough. And I just think that it's relevant. It's so deeply, I think death, we're masking, you nailed it. Like we are masking our fear of death. And I think this conversation is fire.
Yeah, me too. I'm so glad we had it. And I'd love to continue it too, if it makes sense. And
Sure.
hopefully we can engage lots of people in it. Just think it's not like it's step 1, 2, 3. I think it's the energy of the conversation. I trust that each person has their own source to have this conversation or this experience. I don't even need to be a part of it as a death doula. I think I trust the individual journey, that if we could at least step into thinking about it and what are we masking and what are our fears around death, that it can have some profound healing effects, maybe only on an individual level, but if millions of individuals heal and let go of this fear of death, then imagine what we could create as a collective.
Exactly. The alarm's going off.
Is that alarm going off?
Off. Perfect timing. That was literally perfect. Yep. I hope it didn't come. Oh, she's still going. Alexa, off. I guess she didn't hear me. She started going off when you were talking, but I feel like you just nailed it. That if we could instigate this conversation, even if we're not a part of it, but people start having this conversation inside themselves with other people, just even asking the question, what am I so afraid of? I think it has the power to really shift our personal resonance, which if we each individually do it, that's what actually creates a fire. That's what actually creates phenomenon. Right. It has to start from the individual inside out.
And the irony of it with COVID and everything is if you get COVID and you happen to get a version of it that actually is terminal or you get really sick with, you're going to be faced with these questions anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So another way I think energetically to fight COVID is to just go ahead and have the energetic experience of, well, what if I did get it? Yeah. And I got really sick and I was one of the people that happened to die or think I'm going to die. What would I go through? So it's kind of tangible right now.
It is. And that's a great way to release resistance to it, is just to often we're just emotionally don't want to go through it, but we forget that the emotional part of it is the most palpable part that affects our physical health. So if we allow ourselves to go through the emotions, that's the whole transmuting the emotion. And we talked about, some people literally turn their health around by simply transmuting the energy of fear.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And on that note, I know we need to go, but that's a great statement. You nailed it as well. Yeah. Transmuting the fear of anything, really. That energy of fear is a lower vibration that can cause diseases and sickness.
Yep, exactly. Well, I've loved this conversation. Thanks for jumping on and doing it with me. And
Thank you.
I'm excited that I'm going to be posting this on my YouTube channel. So I'll introduce you in the beginning, and for everyone watching, thank you for watching. And I think we'll have more to come.
Yep, I think so too.
All right, cool. Well, have a good day, Erica, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right, thanks. Bye.
See ya.